Hello everybody, my name is Jakob Koschel and I'm a PhD candidate at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam at Vrije. And today I'm going to present to you our work, TagBleed, breaking KASLR on the isolated address space using TLBs. But first, let me tell you how KASLR works. So we have an attacker in user space trying to attack the kernel. And before KASLR, the location of the kernel was always the same. So once the attacker has a primitive to converge control flow in the kernel, the attacker is able to exploit it. So now with KASLR, or kernel address space layout randomization, the attacker no longer knows the position of the kernel. So every time at boot time, the location of the kernel is randomized. And doing a wrong guess in the position of the kernel will cause a kernel panic. So now, the attacker needs to find out where the kernel is located in memory. And to do so, the attacker can use something like a memory leak primitive or a KASLR side channel attack. And such side channel attacks probe if a certain address in the range of the kernel memory or in the potential kernel memory is a valid mapping of the kernel or not. So, to mitigate such attacks, kernel page table isolation, or KPTI in short, was introduced. So now the kernel is no longer mapped in the address space of the user, making those side channels no longer work, and putting the kernel into a separate address space. So on every context switch between user and kernel space, the address space needs to be switched. And this can only be done performantly thanks to TLBs, making this work with very low overhead. And today I'm going to present to you TagBleed, which even though the kernel is no longer mapped in the address space of the user, allows us to derandomize the location of the kernel using information in the TLB. And we can perform such an attack in under a second. Let's talk about KASLR in Linux. So in Linux, it is randomized at boot time for the kernel image. And KASLR entropy is only 9 bits, which is much lower than for user space ASLR. And those 9 bits are the entire page directory. So now let's look at an existing KASLR side channel attack, where the attacker tries to access a page which he thinks the kernel is located. So it will first check if there's a TLB entry for that address. If there isn't, it will check if that address is mapped. So let's, for example, take this page. So it's not mapped. So the user will get a page fault. So now the attacker tries to access this page. So there is a valid mapping. So first a TLB entry will be created, which is the critical part. And then the attacker gets a page fault because he has no permission to access that page. Now, the attacker tries to access the same page again, and because there's a TLB entry, the second page fault will be much faster. So by knowing if the second page fault is faster than the first one or not, the attacker can derandomize KASLR. Now, we have isolated address spaces, so the kernel is no longer mapped in the address space of the user. So there will never be a valid mapping. So there will never be a TLB entry created. So there will never be a faster page fault. So this is successfully mitigated. Let's look at TagBleed without TLBs on an isolated address space. So let's imagine we are priming all entries in the TLB. And then we do a system call. And because we have separated address spaces, we need to flush the TLB, because otherwise there would be invalid entries. So now there's a memory access happening in the kernel. All our entries got flushed, and the kernel adds one entry here. And when we return back to user space, we need to flush the TLB again. So we cannot infer any information left by the kernel without TLBs. Now, with TLBs, we're priming all entries again. Now we do a system call. The kernel does a memory access, which will override one of our entries in the TLB. And all our other entries are still there, because they're only associated with our address space ID. so they don't need to be evicted. So now returning back to user space, the TLB stays the same, and we will be able to probe which entry got evicted by the kernel. Let's talk about the challenges. Challenge number 1, we need to reverse engineer the TLB architecture to find out more about how it works. Challenge number 2, we will figure out that TLB information is not enough, so we need to overcome the residual entropy. And challenge number 3, we need to find out how to time a kernel memory access reliably. For challenge number 1, the TLB set indexing function for huge and super pages is not publicly known, so how do we find out how this one works? And to do so, we reverse engineered the TLB indexing functions for 2 MB and 1 GB pages, and specifically for huge pages, which are used by the kernel image, the 7 bits after the page offset determine the TLB set. And those 7 bits are also used by KASLR. So we have 2 bits of entropy left that we cannot derandomize using the TLB set. So how do we derandomize the 2 missing bits? Can we find an additional side channel attack to fully derandomize KASLR? And to do so, we're using ANC, and for more details I reference back to their paper, which is a side channel attack abusing caching of page table parts in the last level cache. And without sliding, because sliding is very tricky to do, we can only get the 6 higher bits of every page level. So in this case, we can get those 6 bits, which you can see is enough to fully derandomize KASLR. And we even have 4 bits overlaying that we can use for noise reduction. So challenge number 3, timing a kernel memory access is difficult. So is there a reliable way to time a kernel memory access from user space? So to do so, we're using evict and time on a system call. Why a system call? Because it's a kernel operation doing a memory access in the kernel initiated from user space. And to minimize the length of the system call, we're using an invalid system call number to make it as short as possible. To evaluate, we did this on an Ubuntu 18 with KPTI enabled, and we did this both on a Skylake and on an Haswell machine. So here we have a graph where we have the TLB set on the y-axis and the last level cache line from ANC on the x-axis. So you can see certain cache lines and certain TLB sets are slower than others. And because we have the 4 overlapping bits of those information, lots of rows in this graph we can exclude from being possible. So what we're actually looking for is for a TLB set, which is slower than others, in which one cache line is significantly slower than all others, because we first need to evict the right TLB set to actually trigger a page table walk, and then if we evict that part of the page table in the last level cache, we will make a slower page walk than in the other cases. So this is the signal we're looking for. So we get the TLB set 24 and the page table offset of 19. So combining that information, we get the full 9 bits of entropy to fully derandomize KASLR. To conclude, tag TLBs break address space isolation by re-enabling sharing, and TagBleed combines 2 side channel attacks to gain information and to reduce noise and to make a more accurate signal. KASLR can be broken with a single memory access in the kernel, and the final conclusion is that tag TLBs, the very reason that makes KPTI practical, also makes it less secure. Thank you very much for listening.